I'm getting over a head cold, Becca.
Oh yeah, you do actually seem much better than the other day.
Yeah,
Well,
I was
I'd
a
seen the other
mess.
day.
I was a mess. And I don't like spending all day in bed, but I really just couldn't. Actually, I wasn't in bed, I was on the sofa. I needed to just be horizontal
Yeah,
and sleeping. Um,
good. I'm glad that it helped.
but it's raining today, and I should have probably lit the fire, so it's giving like cozy vibes.
Hmm. It's just started reading. It's just started raining really heavy here. And I went out today and I got my car valid because
Well
I
done.
think, yeah, last time I did it was like a year ago
Fair play.
and it really needed doing. So I did that and I felt like I had a really productive day. So I woke up quite late and I was like, oh, I don't have time to do X, Y, Z before meeting to record. But I did have time, but my brain was telling me I didn't have time because I knew I had something coming up. And I was like, nope, don't listen to that. Go out and do your things. And I've had a really productive day and I sorted out so many things with my car that I had needed to do for so long. Like I needed to sort out something with my insurance. I needed to sort out my windscreen. I needed to get it valid. I needed to, yeah. And I finally did them all today.
It's
So it was
so
quite productive.
satisfying, isn't it?
It is.
When you get so much
It
ticked
is.
off your list.
But I let my list build up and then it becomes overwhelming and then I have to do all of it at once.
Sounds like the healthy approach, Becca.
It sounds very much like our topic today.
It actually does. It's a little bit of a segue, isn't it?
It's a little bit of a segue actually,
What are we
because
talking
I
about?
base all or nothing thinking, and it is a segue because I literally did nothing with my car, even though I knew I needed to do it for so long, and then eventually did everything today instead of just doing little bits at a time. Yeah.
So black and white thinking still all or nothing, black and white. Or does it still show up for you today?
Yes, it does. It doesn't show up for me around food because I have done quite a bit of work on recognizing that and moving away from that, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, today about what helped us with that. But it does, I think I have a natural tendency to lean into all or nothing thinking, just in general in my life. And at one point that manifested itself through food. What about you? Do you feel like you have a natural tendency to all or nothing thinking, or for you, was it just food?
Mm, yeah, I would say I have a tendency towards black and white thinking. I like things to fit. I like to be able to put things into a category. I like things to be neat and lined up and make sense to me. Showed up primarily around food and body image. We'll talk about food today. And that is now much better. I notice it more now because I would say my partner doesn't really have any black or white thinking, and he's quite good at offering me the grey area, reminding me of the grey area, and being that
Mm.
middle ground. So I think that helps me to recognize it when it shows up in other ways. Because I don't think the goal is ever to not think like that. It's recognizing when you are in that kind of mindset. I think it thinks it's being productive and it thinks it's helpful, but especially when it showed up around food, it just made things so much more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make. We're not going to talk about all or nothing thinking today and say that it's always a bad thing because I think sometimes it can be a benefit. Sometimes we can use it to our strengths, but being able to recognize it and recognizing when it's becoming a problem is what we're going to talk about. So I guess just to clarify for the listeners, what is all or nothing thinking before we go down that rabbit hole? How would you describe it, Katy?
Oh no. I thought you were going to whack out a Google definition.
I don't have a Google definition, but I can get one if you want.
If you could, that would be great.
I've Googled it. But the way I would describe it is
It's
actually quite similar to what Google's said. All or nothing thinking refers to thinking in extremes, and it gives you the example of being a success. For example, being a success or a failure. Um,
yes. And I think this showed up a lot for me by way of being either on track or being off track with
Hmm.
food. You're
Yeah,
either doing everything right or you've done everything wrong and you've blown it, and now you have to start back
yeah,
at square one again.
yeah. I think that's a good example. I think thinking extremes is the easiest way of thinking of what all or nothing thinking is. It's sometimes known as black or white thinking. I think it's sometimes called polarized thinking as well. But it's this idea, isn't it, of it's this or that, no middle ground. There's no gray area, no nuance. It's a very binary way of viewing the world.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I will say, when I think back to my restriction days, when I was on track, I felt I felt powerful. I
Hmm.
felt like I was just the best. It felt euphoric to me to get to the end of the day, be like, I've done my exercise, I've eaten how I meant to eat, I've stuck within my calorie window. Like, I have been so rigid and so on it. It gave me this rush, it gave me this high.
Hmm.
And I think then what happens is you have something like birthday party, or your friend comes over and she's bought you some chocolates or whatever, and you have one and then you believe you've blown it, and then that leads to that what the hell syndrome eating. When you're used to the rigid thinking, when you're used to the all or nothing, you can't comprehend what to do when you've just done something that you shouldn't, when you've eaten something off track, even if it's just one thing, your brain just can't make sense of it. The response to that for me is to eat more, binge, because I know how to manage a binge. I know how to manage the after effects of a binge. I know what I need to do to get myself back on track. But trying to keep going when you've just had one thing that you feel you shouldn't have had, it was too messy, it was too confusing, I couldn't comprehend it. And so I think speaks to the extremes of it, where
Hmm.
we can push it to the other end because that feels more manageable for us, we're more familiar with that, we know that. The middle ground is too uncertain, it's too unfamiliar, it's easier to be in the extremes.
I think that really speaks to, and you use this word yourself around like the rigidity of all or nothing thinking, and actually how difficult when you have all or nothing thinking. Here we're talking about around food, how difficult it can feel to have flexibility with food. And the idea of having that flexibility just feels so uncomfortable and so overwhelming because our brains don't know how to do it because they've learned to thinking like this. It, it's either this high or it's this low. And I wonder if that's why, partly the reason why it develops, feeling that you described there with like when you were quote unquote on track and eating in the way that you at the time felt that you should have eaten, that it gave you that feeling of almost invincibility and superiority. I can relate to that feeling. And I wonder if that's partly why we can fall into the all or nothing thinking and really make that like a drilled way of thinking because it can almost feel addictive, the high that you get from it.
Yeah, I think that's why we keep picking ourselves back up and jumping back on it. That's what keeps us in the cycle. When we've fallen off track and we feel like we've done something wrong and we're believing the story that's being told of us, we want that high. We want to get back on that high. And that's why we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and jump back onto it the next day because we're chasing that again.
Yeah.
And I think that is a lot of the binge restrict cycle. It's just highs and lows.
I think the binge restrict cycle is like a perfect example of how it shows up with food because the restriction is the it depends which way you view it. Is it the all or is it the nothing? But it's the one extreme side of it is the restriction where you're not eating XYZ and you're exercising in a certain way, blah, blah, blah. And then after some time, we can no longer sustain that. And then we fall into the binge cycle. And then that's the complete opposite, where we're eating all the foods that we didn't eat when we were restricting.
Mm-hmm.
And we're probably not exercising at all. Or we're doing the complete opposite of it. And I think all or nothing thinking like is actually, I personally found it really important to address in recovery and to do some work around, because it was, for me, something that was massive in sustaining that binge restrict cycle over and over again.
I think you touched on something really important there, because I remember going through recovery, and one of the hardest things to do was addressing that black and white thinking, to resume eating as normal after a binge, to not follow up with restriction, to let myself wake up in the morning, not let myself wake up, was to wake up in the morning and have breakfast and have snack.
Mm-hmm.
And if I binged at lunchtime, have an evening snack and have dinner. Like, that was probably the first way I started trying to go against the black and white thinking, was doing the opposite of what I thought I should be doing, which is so difficult because living in rules really was the way in which I made sense of myself. That's how I knew how to feel about myself. And it's like I needed those parameters to make sense of me. I didn't know this middle ground. I didn't know this grey area. I couldn't make sense of it. And so it felt like if I was taking away the black and white thinking, then I felt like I was losing control. I felt like I would just crumble completely. And I couldn't even fathom what that would look like on a day-to-day basis, even outside of food.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually really important to mention, because I think it really speaks to one of the reasons why it can develop, because it can create this illusion of safety. And if for whatever reason you struggle with self-doubt or trusting yourself, having these rules of what you can eat and what you can't eat, which is an example, I think, of that all or nothing thinking, can take away that difficulty in trying to trust yourself, because there's a guide that you follow, there's a rule that you follow. You don't have to fall into that place of nuance, which is very difficult if you struggle with trusting yourself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's helpful to frame it like that.
Mm-hmm. What other reasons do you feel there are for why it might develop in someone?
When I think about, from my experience as a teenager, there is so much going on in your world that you are trying to figure out, you are trying to navigate your way through it. Just being a teenager is just the worst. I'm sorry, I hated being a teenager. I did not thrive as a teenager. It was not my greatest time. And so when I look back at that time when I really latched onto this rigid thinking, I needed something to hold on to. I needed rules to follow. I needed to be told, because a lot of what I originally absorbed around food was what I found in magazines about celebrity diets and things like that. I needed someone else to tell me what to do, and I just needed to follow along. There was something safe in that. There was something that felt like I was doing something right, that I was doing what I should be doing, and it felt like as long as I just stick to these rules, as long as I just do what I meant to do, then everything should be fine and I will feel okay. And I think it soothed a lot of the uncertainty that I felt in myself and who I was and what the world was. And I was navigating a lot. And I think it slotted in nicely for me as a way of trying to make sense of myself and my world at a time when everything just felt very outside of my control. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the messaging that you've shared there from like magazines really highlights how diet culture can play a huge role in developing all or nothing thinking within the context of food. Because we do get so much messaging around what is a good food and what is a bad food. These are in quotation marks. What is healthy to eat? What is unhealthy to eat? What does a healthy body look like? What does an unhealthy body look like? And actually, part of my recovery process was redefining what health is, and from a much more holistic perspective, and challenge the concept of there being a healthy food and an unhealthy food, or a healthy body and an unhealthy body. Um, but you can't deny that that messaging is there a lot of the time. People are not going to sell like diet shakes and these diet plans with a nuanced perspective of health, are they? Like that just doesn't sell as something. But I also think that diet messaging speaks to just a bigger way that we start to learn the all or nothing thinking. Because even if we go like way back to when we're younger, this is just my theory, by the way. If we go way back to when we're younger and we're growing up and we start to learn language and we start to make sense of the world, we get taught things a lot in a binary sense. Like we get taught with language, for example, we get taught to learn like good and bad are opposites, like black and white are opposites, right and wrong are opposites. And I understand why we get taught that, because it's easy to teach a child the meaning of words when you can have this or that. And I think our brains naturally have a tendency, the way they're wired, is to want to put things into categories. So if they can learn to put things into categories, they can make shortcuts, they can work more efficiently. It's easier for the brain to think in that way. But actually reflecting back on that, we get taught to think in that way from a young age. I'm not saying that means that everyone is going to develop black or white thinking and everyone's going to have an issue with food. But for me, it feels like that's quite interesting to see that we learn things that way. Could it play a role in us developing black and white thinking? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and I don't think that's a stretch at all. I think that is something that we learn, and for some of us, we take it to the extreme.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think some people are more prone to thinking in an all or nothing way. Like I say myself, I think I am more prone to think like that just in general, not just with food. I think people who have perfectionistic traits are more likely to have all or nothing thinking. In fact, I think there's research to show that they are. Because if we go back to the example that Google gave us, the example of success or failure, that's a perfect example of how the perfectionistic mind thinks. If I can do X, Y, Z, and then I've achieved success. If there's one thing that's not quite right, then it's a failure. There's very little room in the perfectionistic mind to be like, that could be better, but great, that's fine. Let's get on with it, you know?
Yeah.
So it is quite all or nothing thinking, perfectionism. Um, and I'm not an expert in neurodiversity, but again, I think there's research to show that people who are neurodivergent, whether autistic or have ADHD, also have more of a tendency to think in a black or white way as well. Now, whether that doesn't necessarily mean that is a problem, and it doesn't mean that people are going to develop issues with eating. But I think there's a correlation between autism and anorexia and ADHD and binge eating. So it feels like somehow they could all be interconnected.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful observation because these things influence the way our brains work and context matters. We have to take that into account. Your own experience speaks volumes here. So I was going to ask you, how did black and white thinking show up for you around food?
I think a little bit like we touched on earlier, the binge restrict cycle that I fell into for years and years was an overall example of how it showed up for me. But in a more like specific way, I think signing like moral value to food was one way that it showed up. So it would be like these foods having that list of foods that I could and couldn't eat. So these are good foods, these are bad foods. That is how it would look at the time. And then that would even develop onto, if I eat these foods, I'm a good person. If I eat these foods, then I'm a bad person. So I think the language I used around food was one of the biggest ways of recognizing how it showed up for me. Just my use of like absolute or extreme language was much more present. And I still do it sometimes, not so much around food, but in other areas. And I catch myself doing it. I'm like, oh, there we are, dropping in always into that sentence when I didn't really mean always, but it would show up as that. So things like thinking or saying things like, I always binge on this, or I can never stick to this diet, things like that. They would be the phrases that I would say about myself or think about myself around food.
I really agree with all of that. Noticed it in the language. That was probably when my inner critic was the loudest. And the more I fell off track, the more rigid the rules became, to a point where my rules that I had to follow was just this long list, right, that showed up around food and what I should and shouldn't do. And the way I felt about myself at the end of the day was reliant on how well I'd ticked these boxes, these rules that I had in my head.
Mhm.
And nothing else entered the equation. I could have had
Mhm.
a great day at work, a nice day with my partner. It doesn't matter. The food is the measure here.
Mhm.
That's my indication of a good day and a bad day. And as we know, the difficulty with that is there's no room for flexibility. There's no room for life and for spontaneity. And so I would get into such intense shame spirals, and I would get to such a point of despair based on me eating foods that I believed literally meant that I was weak, I was not good enough, I was greedy. The language, the way I used to talk to myself was truly horrific. I'm trying to think, what did you say at the end? You said something at the end that was really helpful.
I can't remember what I said now.
It was just so good, Becca, that's why. What was I saying, Becca?
I'm not sure where you were going.
I think I remember what you were saying. And the way that you said about one of the first things that you started doing was noticing the absolute thinking, like when that
Mhm.
comes up. And I agree with you, it still sometimes shows up for me now. But recognizing when it's there, because I think we're less likely to buy into it when we can name it for what it is. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's all I have to say with that.
I think it can show up with exercise.
I was going to say that, then I was like, then you're going to go off on a tangent, Katie, talking about exercise, and you're just going to run with it.
I think it's relevant. Like we've spoken about how it could show up around food. But throughout all of my time struggling with various forms of disordered eating, it showed up with exercise. It would be either I am doing some form of exercise that is really intense. I've got to be really sweaty. It's got to be really hard. Or I'm just going to do nothing at all. I'm just going to sit at home. And that was probably then feed into a binge as well. There just was no room for that middle ground. There couldn't be like, maybe I'd benefit from moving my body today, but I'm not really in the mood for kind of heavy workout. I might just go for a walk. There was that just didn't exist. Or if I did go for a walk, because in my mindset I had a very clear definition of what exercise looked like, that walk would not class as exercise for me. It was very, very rigid. I think if you take anything from this episode, maybe you're getting the sense that all or nothing thinking can be very rigid in the sense that we're talking about it.
So during um, lockdown, that's when my exercise got even more obsessive. It went to a next level because obviously the gym's closed and I was heavily weight training and that was taken away from me. And I had like a makeshift gym at home. And I threw myself into running. I would go for a run and let's say I ran 4 miles. Okay, now every run has to be 4 miles.
Mhm.
Like anything less than that, Like you can't do 3.5 miles. You can't do 2 miles. 4 miles is now your minimum. So then when it
Mhm.
got to the point where around 6 miles, I was like, oh no, 6 miles, that's the new minimum now. Now you have to do 6 miles. And I remember going on one run and oh my gosh, my hip. I like running. My knees do not like running. So I really have to be careful, says the woman talking about black and white thinking about exercise. And I remember getting to the 2 mile mark, and the intention was 4 miles. So I was doing 4 miles, and I literally dragged my leg round those 2 miles. I made myself do it. Oh my gosh, you should have seen me. I was destroyed, and I couldn't exercise for months because of the damage I'd done to my hip from forcing myself to do that run. I have to be very careful because if I have a really good weight training session, like what you were talking about, I really like getting sweaty and feeling like I've like really let some energy out, or I've done a good spin class, my brain wants to go, oh, you have to do that every day now. That was really good.
Mm.
You have to wake up and do that tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And this is something I'm still working on with exercise. I think because I'm still very much scarred from how obsessive it was. This tendency to then throw myself all into it, and anything less than that isn't even worth attempting. Saying to myself, oh, that was a really good run. Maybe going to do another one in a few days. It felt mediocre to me. I was like,
Mhm.
no, you should do it every day and you should be really good at it and you should get faster and you should get fitter and then you should like and it just would spiral into this thing. And that, yeah, exercise is where it can still show up for me and I'm very aware of it and I won't let myself go back there. It felt obsessive and anything that wasn't extreme just felt less than. And like, why even bother? Why even attempt it?
Mhm. Yeah. I think you've described quite well like that critical inner voice that comes up with it or can come up with it. And for me, I think that is one of the ways that all or nothing thinking can be a problem. So, like we said, it's not always going to be a problem for everybody. But what can happen is with all or nothing thinking is if you haven't done X, and then because you haven't done X, you then have to do Y because it's either this or that, then we can add a story onto that. Then the inner critic can jump in. What can happen is that spiraling that you've described there, Katy, and then we run the risk of going from all or nothing thinking also into catastrophic thinking. That would look like I've eaten this, that's bad, therefore I'm bad, I'm a terrible person, I've let everyone down, no one's going to love me, everybody's going to think I'm a horrible person because I've done this. And then we're falling into the catastrophic thinking. And I experienced that. Like that is how my brain would have thought in those times. And I just think it's really helpful to see that link about how these two thought processes can join together. And it can then be difficult because we're adding different layers of thought processes onto each other.
I really hear you when you talk about the catastrophic thinking. That seems to come naturally to me. If I'm tired, if I'm having a bad day, if I'm feeling particularly vulnerable, that seems to be where I set up camp. Catastrophic thinking, that's my thing. And I say that's my thing like it's a good thing. Working on it, working on it. We should have called this podcast a work in progress. Um,
Aren't we
so
all works in progress, though?
we are, but the way you talked about it then made me think about how I find my coaching can be around helping clients when they have that black and white thinking, particularly around recovery. And I remember when I used to have it, when you'd maybe have a period of time where it felt like nothing was really shifting. For me, I was at a point where I was like, I'm just eating food and I feel like I'm just never going to stop eating and recovery's not going to work for me, and feeling like recovery had to look a certain way. And if it didn't, I was doing something wrong. And
Mhm.
I don't know whether you experienced that in your recovery, but I definitely did, where there was that tendency to believe that, oh, well, just it's not going to work for me. I'm never going to recover. I think one of the most helpful things I learned in recovery working with a coach was to recognize the black and white thinking and how it, as you said, set off the catastrophic thinking in a lot of instances. but also understanding what was actually going on there. Like when I was in the catastrophic thinking, it was rooted in fear. It was coming from the
Hmm.
fear part of my brain because it always felt urgent. It always felt, oh my gosh, something's wrong. Recovery's never going to work for me. I'm just never going to get there. It's not for me. I'm just going to keep gaining weight and and spiraling into this thing. And to recognize that when you're in that mindset, that you're not thinking clearly, you're not thinking from a place of logic, you're thinking from a place of fear, and that you're not actually responsible for doing anything in those moments because you need to wait for your whole brain to switch back on again before you can look at it with more of a rational mindset. Does that make sense?
Okay, it does. The viewpoint is very limited. You're on a one track way of thinking, and there's no other room for different perspectives. And I think that with both of these ways of thinking, it can be helpful to have, like you say, an external person, like you help people in coaching when they're in this mindset, to come in and perhaps offer an alternative perspective on a different way of viewing things. And that's what part of recovery for me looked like, learning to be able to do that for myself as well, training myself to be able to recognize, I think this, it's either this or that. And, or I think I'm the worst person in the world because I've done this thing, I've eaten this thing. But is there another way of considering it? Is there some gray area that I'm missing? Could somebody look at this situation and view it from a different perspective? Because once we start to bring in that alternative way of viewing things, we start to loosen off a little bit of the rigidity of those ways of thinking.
Yeah. And to also say that it's probably going to feel quite uncomfortable exploring
Mhm.
what this middle ground is, and even just observing it and offering yourself, like, what could this look like? I don't think you have to, because I know I was very resistant to it at the time because the black and white thinking was what I knew, it was familiar, it gave me the illusion of control. And so there was a reluctance to accept a different perspective or a different way of thinking about things. But even just offering the option of thinking about what the grey area would look like in this situation. As you say, I think it inserts the doubt there, doesn't it? It helps to reduce its intensity because I do think like incorporating flexibility feels so uncomfortable at first because it's outside of what's familiar to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think, I think it's a big expectation to put on ourselves to think that we can just offer that new perspective and roll with it straight away. It's more like throwing it there as an option and rejecting it many times before we decide to just try it for one day.
Keep swatting it away until you
Yeah.
get your head around the idea of, okay, maybe I'm slightly open to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in terms of recovery for me, there's a few things that help, but we've already touched on like having awareness of it when it shows up was the starting point.
Hmm.
And that was about recognizing these ways it showed up through language and certain beliefs around food.
Yeah.
Um, Understanding why that was a problem for me. So
Yeah.
why that was creating an issue for me. So for example, recognizing how thinking in that way affects my behavior, which then continues that binge restrict cycle, was helpful. And then some people might say, refer to it as like challenging that. For me, the way I worded it was getting curious about it, which is, it's the same thing. It depends really what term you want to use. But for me, for example, say I said to myself, everyone's going to think I've let them down, okay? Or because I ate in a certain way. That everyone was like, oh, there's my all or nothing thinking here because I'm saying everyone. Let's get curious about that. And that would be like, who? When you say everyone, who do I have in mind? Is there a person in mind there? Because sometimes there would be, or sometimes I might recognize, oh, I'm saying everyone because I'm seeing a lot of messaging in magazines, which is making me think that. Or it might be past experience where someone has said something about eating in a certain way. And I'm thinking of that person and that person's comments about this food. And that's why I'm now thinking everyone's going to think I'm greedy or, for eating this food. So, for example, another one would be for me, I can never say no to crisps. I do love crisps. I still love crisps, right? But then it'd be like, is that never? Or has there been times when actually you haven't eaten crisps? And actually, there would be times when I haven't eaten crisps. So then that would directly make me think, huh, so why am I saying never then? Maybe I'm being a bit extreme in the way I talk about myself or talk about things. So for me, I read a book. It was like a neuro-linguistic programming book, which was all about this. It was about like recognizing the language you use to talk about yourself or situations and how to challenge that language. And that was where like I got that idea from. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna try that. And it was really interesting because it really made me realize how often I use the words everyone, no one,
Hmm.
always, and never.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. Because I think, as you say, that's a lot of, I say a lot of, that's in part of what I try and offer clients. That different perspective, that different way of thinking, without the pressure of having to take anything on board, but just holding space for it, I think, really, because when we are so rigid, we don't even know what the other option is. We don't even know what that looks like and how helpful it is to have someone else, or as you said, to explore it for yourself. Hey, what's a middle ground here? What's a different way of looking at it? Yeah, I think that was spot on.
I feel like that offering of a middle ground for me, I think it's quite helpful to do that outside of food. Like with in terms of exploring the language I used around food, I would do that. But I think who is it who says it? There's somebody who says like how we eat is how we do everything. Maybe it's Janine Roth. Is it Janine Roth?
It
I don't
might,
know.
I've heard of that. Yeah, I've heard of
Yeah,
that
something
sort of
like that. And
statement.
sometimes like going into a new perspective with food might feel too big or feel too scary initially because it's so loaded with emotion. And I found it quite helpful to question, like, is there another way of viewing this situation just in other areas of my life, like other circumstances, other situations that happened, or maybe I held a certain belief and someone had a different one. Instead of being really rigid and fixed to my belief, getting a bit more curious about what that other person thinks, or in a certain scenario, I might think, oh, a person's done this because da, 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 da. And then catching myself and going, actually, is there another reason they might have done that other than what I think? And that helped me because it didn't feel like threatening or scary to do that in other contexts. But doing it outside of food then allows you to start to train your brain to have a little bit more flexibility that then when you do start to implement that with food, it doesn't feel as unfamiliar or weird or scary because your brain's, oh, okay, we've done this in this other area. Maybe that's how my brain speaks, but does that make sense? I think
Yeah.
I think it's sometimes easier to start to bring nuance into other areas of your life first.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think if trying to approach it, trying to explore flexibility around food feels too threatening, if that feels like that's too much, then practicing it outside of food in day-to-day life, where that may show up around like expectations around, I don't know, housework, work, things like that. We have these judgments of ourselves, we have these expectations of ourselves, exploring what the middle ground looks like in these other areas of your life away from food, as you said, to get a feel for it, really, so it doesn't feel so scary and alien when you then start to practice it with food.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think excellent point, Becca.
Is there anything else that you would add about what helped you in navigating all and after thinking, overcoming it in terms of like exercise, food, just recovery in general?
I would say that, I know you touched on this, paying attention to language, as in when I was making these like absolute statements, oh, I've done this and I've ruined XYZ. One of my favorite statements I always lean on is being like, and there's a chance that isn't completely true. Like,
Mm,
just to offer a
like that.
little bit of doubt in there. Like, there, yeah, okay, I feel like I did this, and okay, to offer a statement, I did this and now I'm a failure. But there's a chance that's not 100% true. There's a chance that's not completely true. I don't have to believe it because in the moment I wouldn't, to be honest. But the offering of doubt in there, just for that part of your brain that's really latched onto this belief, this truth, to offer it this idea that actually maybe that's not completely true, like the power of and statements or statements, which is
Mhm.
dialectical thinking, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that, Katie? Because I know
So
that that's
I
something that helped you. I think it's something that helped you.
okay, so dialectical thinking, it helped me move away from the black and white because it encourages like an and, a both slash and perspective. It allows for the understanding situations by accepting multiple perspectives or ideas and that they can be valid simultaneously, if that makes sense. So, like holding two truths. This shows up for me by being like, hey, I'm doing my best, but there's still room for improvement.
Mhm. The two can exist together.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be this absolute thing. It doesn't have to be, oh my gosh, I'm a failure, I'm the worst. It's, hey, that maybe didn't go how I planned it, but there's room for improvement, or I'm still learning, I'm a human being.
That sounds like that would be really helpful to touch that catastrophic thinking.
Yes.
This didn't go how I planned, and I'm not a bad person, for example. That helps to stop that catastrophic thinking.
Yeah, because there's the, I automatically don't so much anymore, but the tendency is to internalize it versus not attaching to it.
My understanding of dialectical thinking is like what you say, bringing in multiple perspectives, but also around understanding that like nothing is all good or nothing is all bad.
Mm.
And the way I think I'm quite a visual person, and the way I'm imagining this, I don't know if this is going to be helpful for people. If you're a visual person, then hopefully it will, is thinking about the yin and yang symbol of how, like, within the yin, there's a little bit of yang, and within the yang, there's a little bit of yin. So it's like when we start to think that everything, this is good and that's bad in terms of food, like actually bringing it in to say there's nothing that's entirely good or entirely bad. What you think is really good, actually, there could be some elements to that that are harmful for you. And what you think is bad, actually, there could be some good things about that actually are good for you. For an example, what I'm thinking is I very much had this belief when I had like an eating disorder that I should only eat fruit and veg. But actually, now, because I've got a more nuanced perspective, I'm like, eating just fruit and vegetables isn't all good for me because that's not good entirely for like my mental, my emotional health to only eat fruit and vegetables. And I'm going to be missing certain nutrients if I only do that. Likewise, eating processed food isn't all bad because there is a place for it because it's fun and it allows you to eat in social circumstances. It's good for like my mental and my emotional well-being. I hope that's a helpful kind of example to how you can use that idea of nothing is all good, nothing is all bad to challenge that all or nothing thinking.
That was really helpful, I would say. I think that really speaks to the flexibility. And I think that speaks to the food freedom, which is where we ultimately strive to end up at, isn't it? Where we can take information, we can absorb it, and we can decide what makes sense for us and what we want to take on board and what isn't helpful, what doesn't help us.
Yeah. So just think in your mind, can I yin yang this? Can I yin yang this thought?
That's brilliant.
Literally just made that up.
So it could go on a t-shirt, really, if you were dedicated enough.
Well, we'll see if it takes off.
I have a feeling it will.
Also, do you know what helped me? Trying to connect to the emotion behind, because obviously we're talking about thoughts here. So this is very cognitive, but trying to connect with what is the emotion behind this was helpful. So let me try and think of an example. So if we go back to the idea of having good or bad foods that we eat, I use that as an example because I feel like it's probably the most common and the easiest way to digest how all or nothing thinking shows up. Instead of trying like following that rigid binary way of thinking, when it showed up, trying to connect with like, what is actually the emotion underneath this? Like, how am I feeling? So that might be, I'm feeling out of control. I'm feeling unsafe because I'm feeling out of control, or I am feeling lost. And being able to put a name to what the feeling is then helped me because I could focus on what that was rather than following the story of the thoughts. That makes sense?
Yeah, like buying into the story,
Yeah,
believing.
it takes us a little bit out of the head and a bit more into the body of what we're experiencing and going, okay, so if I'm feeling lost or if I'm feeling unsafe, like how can I look after that? How can I look after myself with that feeling?
Yeah. And and I just want to speak to anyone who's listening to this who is in a recovery place and still very much working through trying to move away from the binge restrict cycle, that I think observing the emotion and starting to explore that doesn't have to be in place of the food. Because when it shows up the way that you're talking about, like that what the hell thing, tapping into what's actually going on here, like what, because you're right, there's an underlying emotion at play or just something that needs to be acknowledged and validated for yourself. But to use it as a practice to start to understand the way that you're feeling versus a tool that will stop you eating.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I get you. So you could like, you can still explore what that feeling is and you can still binge. It
Yes.
may still happen that way. And
Yes.
that's okay because that is part of recovery, not like the goal isn't to feel the emotion to stop the binge. And if you don't stop the binge through feeling the emotion, then you're a failure, etc., etc. And we fall into that catastrophic thinking again.
Yes. Yes. The expectation to be like, if I sit and name how I'm feeling, then I won't need the food and I won't go for the food. And depending on where you are in recovery, if you have restriction, if there's like hunger there, then that's going to be far more distressing for you. But I think it's
Mhm.
so important what you spoke about naming the emotion, because that's going to be driving the black and white thinking, isn't it? That's going to be driving the extreme thinking. That's what's going to want to increase that pull to fall into the extreme versus being in that the uncertainty of the grey area.
Mhm. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I think it's important.
This is one of the most challenging things about doing a podcast is like everyone has their own experience and you just never want
Mhm.
to dismiss someone's experience, but it's so hard to accommodate all the nuance and everyone's kind of thing.
Yeah.
So this is why we speak of our own experiences and we try and be helpful. We try and offer information from our own perspective, but we really appreciate hearing your stories, listeners, and your experiences and what resonates with you and what doesn't resonate with you. That's really helpful for us. Our email will be at the end of this video anyway, because we've got a lot of editing to do, Becca, because we're like well over an hour. See, time flies when we're just in a flow.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important to mention that everyone's experiences is different. And just really want to shine a light on the fact that we are talking about all or nothing thinking here in the context of food in a way that it can cause issues. If you have all or nothing thinking because that's the way your brain is naturally wired to, and actually it works for you, and it doesn't present in the way that we're talking about, then brilliant. Like, we're not saying that all or nothing thinking in general is a bad thing. In fact, sometimes I think it can be, we can use it to our advantages. So take what feels relevant for you in this episode. And if it doesn't speak to you, it's okay. You don't need to take anything from this episode.
Yeah, you get to decide black and white thinking shows up for you in a way that's problematic. I think we all have to get to a point where we can recognize for ourselves this isn't actually helping me anymore. And yeah, again, as we said, it's not something that won't necessarily. Okay, we just gonna ramble, Becca. But thank you all so much for listening. Sorry, Becca has something else to say.
I have one more thing that I need to announce on this podcast
Oh my God, what is
that
it?
you may have noticed on the wonderful Katy.
What is it? It's not a bug, is it?
On her. No,
Oh, okay. I was like, thought you were
but
gonna be like, she's had a spider on her head this whole time.
no. Oh my God, I would not be that cruel. That
I
the
was.
wonderful Katy has a beautiful ring on her
Oh God.
fingernail. Can you show the listeners if they're on YouTube?
Oh, oh my God, it's so embarrassing. Look how red I go straight away. Yes, lucky me. It was lovely. I went to the Maldives. It was picturesque. It was a pleasant surprise. When I say a pleasant surprise, it was a complete surprise. And we are in the, actually, I'm not wedding planning yet, but we're in just the enjoying the engagement bubble that we're in,
Yeah.
which is lovely.
So congratulations, Katy. And listeners, please share your thoughts on all or nothing thinking and send in congratulations to Katy.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Becca. Thanks everyone for listening. Please send
Thanks for
your
listening.
feedback. I'm still red. That's so my thing. I always go bright red. Okay. Thanks,
Anyway,
guys. We
thanks
will
for
catch
listening.
you on the next one.